also
Oh, good.
all sessions. Yeah.
So welcome to week 8. And this week we're moving on from the looking at a whole range of ICTs and different uses of technology in education. And now we're starting to look in more detail about policy, and particularly policies that can enact change. Because it's all well and good to learn about new technologies, but actually implementing them in a school or in a classroom or a country involve a whole range of challenges beyond just learning about the technologies themselves. So that's really where we're starting from over the next few weeks, looking at how we can actually make those technologies make a difference in terms of students learning and in the teaching process and everything else in an organization. So I'll just open up there's really only, well, there's a couple of readings associated with this week. Can I get an indication of how you've engaged with those readings, or have you been focused on a certain assignment or set of assignments?
Yeah, me, I haven't done the readings, really sorry, because I have definitely been doing the assignment.
Okay.
Sorry.
I do make allowances, and I do understand the focus that you need to place on assessment. It's a natural aspect. So when you do come to the readings, you'll discover that it's really just one reading. The second one is a repeat of a chapter from the first one, in fact, the first chapter. And then there's a video clip that sort of provides another alternative way of looking at. But there's a report from UNESCO that's contained in the readings, and there's 3 particular chapters that I ask you to have a look at, 1, 2, and 8, that explore how different organizations and particularly different nations have undergone incorporating ICT into their education systems. So just going to send out some more invites. So if you receive an invite, just ignore it. I just noticed there's a couple of people trying to join us. Okay. So I'll share that document and we'll have a little look through it. Of course, you may have access to it on your computers as well. So the document contains a series of reports that were developed for the United Nations or the UNESCO organization around transforming education through the use of ICTs. So it's not purely about the use of ICT, it's also about actually changing education as a whole through the introduction of ICTs, which is a much higher goal than just integrating the use of the technology. So the first chapter that we look at is on technological, economic, and social context for educational ICT policy by Cosma. And essentially, he's looking at ways that we can use technology to influence policy changes. And you can read through the various aspects in detail, but he looks at the historical uses of ICT and then more recent trends. So particularly around the world, we've seen quite a huge increase in the use of technology in education, and that's certainly not decreasing. But it started all with telephones and the internet, and then has moved on to, well, particularly the World Wide Web and the internet has been a major factor, but also mobile phones for large parts of the world have been the major access they have to technology. And a lot of countries use mobile phones as a way of engaging with educational technology, far more than we do in the Western countries. But the report goes through and compares access to ICT in most countries in the world. And you can have a look at those and sort of see where different countries sort of fit. But the technology has also included television, and there's been a lot of studies on the impact on society from technology, particularly around Western media and how that has influenced society, but also around Indian media, for example. The movie industry in India is equal to the West, and it has a huge influence on their society, and also into education through the use of media in education. So jump in at any stage of questions. I know you haven't read the report, so it's a little bit difficult, but if you've got questions on what I'm talking about. Now, the report identifies two major paradigm changes from mass production through to information technology, and how society and industry and education have changed quite significantly as a result of these paradigm changes. And we're also looking then, while education has been a little bit resistant to that paradigm change, given that everything else has changed with an information technology paradigm, the expectation is that education will follow suit and will move much more away from an industrial mass production process in education towards niche markets in education around individualization for students, online courses that are suited to individual students rather than large groups of students being instructed in the same way, and a whole lot of other sort of large economic and social forces that are moving education towards particular approaches. Anyone got any comments on that before we progress on? Have you seen changes in education since when you were at school? Has nothing changed in education? Yes, Hiten.
Yeah, for me, it hasn't. It has no change when I was in Iran, but when I came here, of course, everything 100% changed, and yeah, but I think that the change will come in Iran too, and what my assignment is also about technological changes that I think and I have planned to implement in Iran.
So what sort of changes have you seen? Having come to Australia and experienced a different educational system, particularly one that has embraced the use of ICT, how has that been different to your previous experiences?
The most important aspect of this change is that you can have the course information and course contents online and at home, and it provides the opportunity for you to have to use your the class time to build a better cognition, to better understanding about the issue, about the topic, instead of receiving information in the classroom. In Iran, in the classroom, because of the time limitation, you have to ignore unnecessary information, and you have to ignore all the discussions, all the it's only transmission of information that are all exist in other place, and if you can provide it on internet or in some place, make it accessible, it doesn't take all of your time, your class time, to just transmit information. It was very, 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 very useful, and as inspiring for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And you pick up on one of the major changes that has occurred in recent years. Certainly when I went through university, we spent all of our time simply copying down notes, and really the lecturers were about presenting information from textbooks and for us copying that down so that we would have our own version of that.
Exactly.
And the assumption was that we would take that away and we would study that, and tutorials were provided to do exercises around that. But now, because information is so ubiquitous and we can share information so much easier, the process of making students copy down large quantities of content has been replaced by more discussions and more. There's still a fair bit of transmission occurring, but it's quite a different type of transmission. It's much more around understanding of concepts rather than acquisition of content. And so academics will use a lot more videos and interactives and demonstrations than they may have had the opportunity to do so in the past. And the same goes through into schools. So Patricia, do you have any reflections on how things have changed since when you went through your early schooling?
Yeah, actually, a funny thing is I left school a bit early. I was, well, I guess now I would have been identified as a gifted student, so I was bored stupid at school. Went infrequently. It got less and less as I got up to grade 11 and 12. It was just, there was nothing. If I could have stayed and done English and history all day, I would have done. But having to do, and this is good for me because this is a battle I see in in the students on program as well, in special ed. But when I went back, I was 25, I think, when I made it to uni, and through a series of different ways. But I can remember the shock at going to the library to research. Actually, sorry, I'll put my video on. I find it disconcerting to look at pictures of myself. And going back, so when I'd left school a while before then, it was all microfiche. Remember those, Jason?
I do indeed.
And when I went back, there were these little, like, tower things. And I thought, well, if it was a microwave, I could heat my coffee. But it was like all the Apple stuff, and oh my God, and the old Apples that had the printers that had like the chunky bits on the side. You know, the floppies were this big and then they went smaller. So it's been a lot of fun in one way, from my schooling to that and then to now. And so I guess that's why I'm so fond of technology, because for me as a writer, having to write when I was young was okay, but you know, you have to rub things out. So now with the freedom of the word processing that you have and the power of it, I can understand why kids get excited about it. Because for some teachers, oh no, they should still be copying down, like they honestly believe that, and because that's where the research is, we don't have enough research to say that there's, you know, what is best practice? What is digital best practice? I don't believe the research is there yet. I had that conversation with one of my profs at ASU, and he said, yeah, schools are throwing the baby out with the bathwater. They're adopting ICT, but not really, the research doesn't support a lot of what they're doing as practice. They're just like winging it. Maybe you would call it rapid fire testing, I don't know, but like a lot of schools seem to be winging it. And the biggest issue I have with technology, I guess, is that to me, it's like it's the middle classes making more middle classes. It's the politics behind it that upsets me. Because I'm in special ed, so many of these countries completely ignore special ed to put their money into knowledge, you know, the area of knowledge creation, which they believe will benefit their country the most. But my heart's with the kids with a disability. So that's my conflict with it.
No, absolutely, and it is a major issue. Not particularly in countries that only have a certain amount to invest. They will invest in what they see to give the greatest benefit, and that will always then leave aside certain sectors of their population. It's only really rather wealthy countries and that have the opportunity to address all the issues as they progress forward. But it doesn't mean that they may not then revisit those aspects once they've advanced other areas. It just means they may not advance across the board as we might do so, placing a great importance on all students progressing and having the same opportunities. So there are challenges around those issues. But that's part of the process of exploring these aspects and looking at how countries and schools implement the use of technology. Because what occurs at a country level could also occur at a school level or even an individual classroom level, where a school or a teacher will make very similar decisions. What might be a technology that will help the largest number of students, but it may disadvantage a couple of students. And what are the ethical aspects of doing that and the challenges around trying to ensure that all of our students have opportunities to learn, supported by change. And the issue around research into educational technologies is always evident. And it's always a problem because technology advances so quickly, it's impossible to have research lead the way. And almost all educational technology research is focused on innovators and what they're doing and trying to keep up with what's happening rather than showing what's the most appropriate way forward. But it does happen slowly. There's now a huge amount of research around the use of video, and before that, audio in the classroom. So even though it might be a 10-year lag, the research does eventually catch up. And no doubt there'll be lots of research available eventually on the use of mobile devices and the internet and all the other aspects that are becoming available at the moment. We don't have the luxury of 200 years of study of an area such as in mathematics.
Yeah.
But even mathematics had a huge change. When I went through school, the introduction of calculators was a hugely controversial issue.
Yeah.
And even today, we still have people arguing against the use of calculators in schools.
Yep.
So yeah, technology is always going to, unfortunately, because it's always on the cutting edge, or at least that's the area that we're looking at. There's always lots of other technologies that people forget about, like the book and a whole lot of other things. They forget that they're all technologies or were technologies at one stage that were of equal concern.
Yep.
Yeah, so it's just the nature of educational technology that we do have to sort of step out of the comfort zone of assured research and take risks and explore alternatives. But teachers are fairly responsible.
Yeah, but what I find, just this little comment is that I had a colleague retire about 2 years ago. Now he keeps coming back as a contract teacher, but he just could not cope with the amount of ICT that he was expected to use, and he didn't want to cope. So he actually resigned. Like, I find that mindset just so difficult to grasp. Do you know what I mean? I just find people like that very hard to, not to relate to, because we get on very well, but it just puzzles me that people see it as not worth the effort when it's all around us.
Well, it has to do with priorities and also their own identity to a large extent. And it is a major area of, we're not going to get too much into that in this course, but it's one of the key factors that I do research around in terms of teacher identity and how that needs to change in order to affect the introduction of technology. Because if your identity is particularly based around your content knowledge, that can be a huge challenge from technology, which then diminishes that aspect. So for a lot of teachers who have built up huge expertise and are now being told that different pedagogical approaches where that is no longer valued because of access to technology, that's a really significant challenge to who they are as a teacher and who they are as a person. So it's not at all surprising that a lot of people are really challenged by that and do react in different ways. And part of managing a change process in an organization is taking that into consideration and slowly assisting people to reframe who they are as a teacher with the challenges of change in pedagogy and change in technology. But we'll only get a chance to touch on some of those issues in the last couple of weeks. But it is a major challenge. Okay, so we better get back to the reading. Excuse me. Let's get down to another bit that we can summarize. Okay, so the impact of ICT on education has been defined in a number of different areas. The main one, of course, of interest to educators is changes to student outcomes. Do they learn more effectively through the use of technology? And as you point out, Patricia, that's not often supported by evidence, because it takes quite a bit of lag time in order to identify changes in student learning, because of the whole range of complexities that we have around student learning. It's not just ICT that's often involved. It might be other programs, behavioural management programs that are in place, changes in pedagogy, changes in staff all the time. All of these things are having an effect on student outcomes. So identifying just the ICT aspect and trying to identify if that was the reason why things improved or not is quite difficult. Unfortunately, we don't have the capacity as we do in medicine to do large-scale blind trials where we use placebo approaches and real approaches and then compare them. Ethically, we can't really do that to students. They seem to be able to do it, no problems with medicine, but in education, we can't not do our very best for all of our students. Although there is some approaches being done around keeping things the same and trying new approaches and trying to do that on a large enough scale that we can get statistical evidence that an effect is being demonstrated from the use of new technologies, but they're extremely rare, particularly in Australia. The US does have some of those large-scale processes, but unfortunately we don't often have that financial support in Australia to conduct that level of research. A number of other issues, particularly the one that, Patricia, you identified, the impact on diverse students, where if you're just providing support for the mainstream students, you're going to not particularly support those at either end, the exceptional students and the students that have difficulties with learning. Teacher skill and practice, we've also touched on, is a very important aspect around the introduction of technology. And for many, many teachers, they don't have a lot of experience with technology. They don't tend to use it a lot in their own personal lives. That is changing a little bit, but certainly nowhere near as much as the general population. Mostly because teachers are just so busy. They don't have the opportunity to play and explore technologies as many other people in society do who don't take any work home in the evenings or on the weekends. So another area I do a lot of research in is around computer games. And it's quite startling how few teachers play computer games compared to mainstream population, which is around about 60%. And for teachers, it's less than 20%. And I put that mostly down to the busyness of teachers and the fact that teachers are so often spending their free time preparing lessons and preparing resources for use in education rather than their own entertainment. And what use they do have of those things, they tend to apply to their own children or to their students, not to themselves. So while they might engage with a computer game, it'll be much more around what could they then use that computer game for their students' learning, rather than what they could use it for their own entertainment or their own learning. But then there's also various access barriers and things of that nature, lack of internet connections, lack of the technology itself, and a whole range of other issues, which can also be policy issues, restricting the uses in various ways, particularly around online use of technology. Okay, so that's that first chapter. Let's hear from you guys about some of those issues.
Yes, Dr. Zagami, accessing internet is one of the major difficulties of using internet in Iran. In addition, that many people have no access to internet at all. The majority of people who have access on internet, the quality of access is very low. That's sometimes it is not possible to have the conversation that we have now. It wouldn't be possible because it's very, very slow, and many people try not to use that because it's actually doesn't work well. And the point is that it is not it is by it's not mistakenly. I mean it's governments that do that. Do you know? I don't know how I can say that.
I do understand the issue. Yeah.
Government wants internet to be slow because internet have lots of makes lots of challenges for them, because Iran is very it's everything is censure in Iran, and they don't want to be free transformation of news and everything. Do you know what I mean? And also many sites are filtered in Iran. It's censored and filtered, and unbelievably, the sites like Facebook or even YouTube are filtered, and you can only access with those sites with anti-filter applications that make the speed of internet very, very low.
Yes, no, I do understand, and it's certainly not just Iran that has those issues. Many other countries face similar restrictions, particularly China, which is sort of they have quite good internet speed and so forth, and are very well developed in terms of technological infrastructure, but they still have all the restrictions and the limitations on access to materials that do make it challenging. And in some ways that can be challenging for us as well, because there's a lot of fantastic stuff happening in those countries that other countries would like to share and engage with, such as students communicating together between those countries. And a lot of cultural barriers can be broken down through such interactions, and they can limit those opportunities. But we do need to work within the systems that are there, and we can certainly challenge those restrictions, but in the main, educators are not particularly influential in making societal changes at that level. We certainly change things a lot on an individual student body level, but not so much on existing governmental policy. So it's just something that you'll need to consider in your assignment work and in your plans for implementation. But there are ways of using other technologies other than online communications. And it may be down to using CDs and sharing material on physical devices like USB sticks and so forth to distribute information and set up exchange and communication between students. So there are alternatives. One of the good things about the rapid advance of technology is that we can just look back 10 years and see how we used to do things, and then apply those in circumstances where things are not quite as advanced. So one thing you could look at is just how we did do things on the internet 10, 20 years ago, when we did have very, very slow internet connections, and we did have to use other approaches, but there were still some fantastic learning activities occurring back then. And in some cases, some of them were even better than the learning activities that we have in many schools now. We used to focus a lot more on students connecting with each other around the world, and that might have just been by email, and sharing images and learning about each other's countries using that technology, rather than online video conferencing and other tools that are now available. So yeah, that would be my advice, in that as you're looking for things, don't just consider the latest that's available in some countries and that may not be applicable in your particular circumstances. But if you look back at how things were being done a little while ago, you may find plenty of opportunities to enact change to what has occurred in the past.
Yeah, of course.
Patricia, did you want to say anything about any of the issues just raised in that chapter?
I actually lived in China for a while, so I'm very aware of the restrictions there. But when I was in Arizona, there's always some Chinese kids there, and one I spoke with, she was telling me, because I was living in China about 20 years ago, and that, you know, she wasn't even, I think she might have been 20 years old, so she was really interesting to talk to, and it is very exciting. I think she went to Beijing Uni, one of the big ones, but the work, she was in education as well. She was studying to be a high school teacher, and the work that they were doing then was with robotics in the classroom, and you know, it's just really exciting to know that those opportunities are not just available, but are being actively, you know, pushed. But then their system is also tiered, so they're only going into the very top layer schools. You know, once again, you have the political issues. And this girl herself, like she said, oh yes, the travel restrictions, it's very easy now to leave China. Well, it turns out her grandparents are very high up in the party, so she had no problems getting her documents signed. I've known others who couldn't get anything signed. So, do you know what I mean? It's just fascinating, but it's also heartening to, because I really love the Chinese people. They're very people of the heart, and it is really good to know that it's being more progressive, kind of progressive, than in the past. So they're also struggling with this stuff. Now, yeah, there is one thing I wanted to say. In Ed Queensland, in the last couple of months, just the last couple of months, we're now getting a lot more restrictions on, I don't know if you call them third party. So let's say I create, what's it called, like Kaboom or some name like that I used to do, where you create like your class thing and then you'd run like a quiz and the kids can answer straight away within the classroom. But Ed Queensland is now saying, oh, there's too many of these of these happening, so they're clamping down and they're actually saying they're cutting off access to these. Would they be called third-party things, Jason? I don't know the right term.
In the main, Education Queensland has issues with anything that students have to sign up to.
Yes.
And
yes.
because,
and teachers, I guess.
And teachers, yes. And it's a little bit contradictory in that Education Queensland wants to keep everything within a restricted,
yes.
only sign up to environment,
yes.
but not have the students engage in any other restricted environment that's been set up by anyone else.
Yes.
There's a little bit of a contradictory argument in that aspect, but it is what it is.
Yeah.
And it has been well identified that it is a problem throughout Education Queensland, and there's more and more resources that they no longer have access to, and there's a lot of great resources out there.
Yeah.
But again, that's a policy level process of change, and at the moment in Education Queensland, the IT people tend to be more in charge than the educational people, which does restrict things. I'm currently doing an online course for Education Queensland with 1,000 students or 1,000 teachers, and using a lot of online technologies, many of which teachers don't have access to, or at least access to through the Education Queensland system.
Yep.
So it's an ongoing challenge, an ongoing issue, but it's a systemic policy level decision-making process that needs to change. And that will change eventually and it has been. They've recently allowed the use of Google tools and the Google environment, where previously that was very much off, not allowed. So there are movements and changes happening. For many, many years, Education Queensland took the view that they would replicate the internet within their own system, and spent a huge amount of money doing that, many tens of millions of dollars. But with more recent cutbacks, they've had to look at alternatives, because they lost all of that infrastructure, they lost all that technical support.
Yep.
And the Learning Place version 3 was cancelled, and it had lots of, they'd basically built virtual worlds and a whole lot of other tools, replicating ones that existed on the internet. But because they didn't have the technical support any longer, they couldn't implement those. And so there are cracks in the walls happening because they're coming to understand that they can't sustain the level of innovation that's occurring on the internet within a closed system. But it'll take a little bit longer before that fully gets adopted. But it is happening.
Okay.
Okay, so let's move on then to chapter 2. This is by a different author, or in fact, a set of authors, I believe. Oh no, this is by Cosma again. Okay, this goes through a number of summaries. So again, he's using his concept of mass production into knowledge creation as a paradigm shift. And as we move down, okay, he's got a ladder of educational change, starting with, there we are, basic education, then knowledge acquisition, knowledge deepening, and finally knowledge creation. And he sees many countries moving along that process, where for a lot of countries that hadn't really had an education system in the past, just providing a basic education was the main priority. Then they moved towards knowledge acquisition, where, as we discussed before, a lot of education was around transmission of information, with students recording that information in their notebooks, and simply that process of transmission. But then we have movements towards knowledge deepening, and this is using a whole range of technologies and pedagogies to deepen students' understanding about concepts. So rather than just receiving a whole lot of printed material and having to understand that printed material themselves, using various approaches and activities and projects and demonstrations and laboratory experiments, and writing camps and all that sort of stuff to deepen their understanding of what they're learning rather than just learning the facts. And then finally, we're moving into an area of what's called knowledge creation, where the students are actually not just learning about something, but creating new knowledge about things. This is, of course, complex and difficult, particularly in areas of the sciences and mathematics, which are so well refined. But particularly in the area of the arts and English and things of that nature, where students can be more creative, it's not so much learning about how to paint in a particular style. It's about learning what new styles you might create yourself to express an artistic perspective. Of course, it doesn't exist in isolation, and some people do see these things as separate entities, but in reality, they all build upon one another. You can't really have knowledge creation unless you've had a deepening understanding of the knowledge, and you can't really do that without some transmission of some knowledge, and you can't do that without some basic skills in terms of being able to read and write and do simple arithmetic. But we are seeing knowledge creation as being the goal of many educational reform agendas. And we're seeing that in the new digital technologies curriculum, for example, that's been introduced into the Australian curriculum, where the goal is for students to create new ways of engaging with technology rather than just learning about technology. So creating their own online textbooks or their own apps or their own computer games, rather than just learning about them. So I'll pause there and let you have a chance to discuss that. Hutan, what do you think about that 4 steps of educational progression?
It is lovely. I'm actually familiar with these steps because I've already passed some courses about curriculum and different style of pedagogy, and I'm really interested in, and I think they have already changed my mind completely, and I have lots of plan to change my style, and yeah, my vision is completely changed um, about um, about teaching, about pedagogy, about curriculum, and yeah, they are very interesting stuff. They are new, but they have already uh, changed my my teaching style, I think.
Wonderful. And Patricia, did you want to mention anything?
Well, I'm sure I've mentioned it before, but in the area of special ed, like as new technologies come on board, it just gets better and better for certain disabilities, really. Especially like the kids with vision impairment. Just take your smartphone, you can take pictures of the board notes, you can blow it up so you can see it. Like, it's just fantastic. We have had to get past teachers saying, "Oh, you can't use a phone in class." So that actually was just this year when the school changed their policy. So it just seems really, yeah, Jay, I just get frustrated because of the short-sightedness. People would rather cling to policy than go, "Oh yeah, that's an actually really valid point." That's a bit silly. But yeah, I guess what I did want to say is when I was before I left the States, I was reading Harvard Business Review or Quarterly or whatever, and they did so a lot of the new startups, they're not actually, what they're doing is they're building on an idea that's already in market. So my thing that I am fond of talking about is deep learning. Are the ICTs promoting rapid, like shallow learning? I mean, we could have an argument over what is the nature of learning anyway, like what is it? Are we seeing a shift in what we will regard as learning? Do you know what I mean? And the other thing that concerns me is children younger, they're engaging with these things when they're with, what we know now about neuroplasticity of the brain. So would the brain, in neuroscience, is the brain actually being rewired?
Yeah, it's an interesting discussion around the rewiring of the brain. Every learning process rewires the brain.
Right.
That's the nature of learning. It's the physical process of learning. So it's a little bit of a throwaway line in that respect. The argument really is, are we learning in a physical way very differently? Is the brain processing information and structuring things very differently? And yes, it is. But we've seen that happen in many times before in history. Moving to print versus oral languages would have had a massive change to the brain. We would have changed a huge change of emphasis from the auditory processing areas of the brain, which would have diminished, and the visual processes would have increased. So there's undoubtedly other subtle changes happening, but in terms of them being negative changes, I'm very dubious that there's that aspect occurring. There will be certain strengths and weaknesses occur, but individual variations and individual aspects probably outweigh those more generalized approaches. You'll always have certain students that will develop more effective ways of learning through different means, but in terms of very widespread radical rechanging of the brain, no, that's not occurring. And there's no evidence of that. But we are learning much more about how the brain works, and we're modeling the brain now, and within a few years, we expect to actually know the learning process down to the cellular level. And that will then allow us to understand how learning occurs far more than we currently do. And then we could start tracking those aspects. But given the complexity of how the brain processes information and stores information and retrieves information, technology is not going to have a major impact upon that. But I may be proved wrong in that respect.
It's just a fascinating area with all the neuroscience that's happening. It's a really interesting area.
It is, absolutely, and I do a lot of research in that area.
Right. Sorry.
No, I've got a couple of...
Because my son has Asperger's, is an Aspie, and I deal with a lot of Aspies. And so the wiring of the brain is always of interest to me.
It is. And at the moment we're at a point where we can experiment with that sort of stuff, but we can't really know those processes in great detail.
Right.
So like I use EEG headsets all the time, and I've got a class set that I use in schools and measure all that and get really great understanding of how learning occurs as large groups. But when it comes down to individuals' learning processes, we don't know enough yet about the physical processes occurring in the brain related to learning. We're learning more every year, and it won't be that much longer before we really do understand it. But at the moment, there's a number of conflicting theories, and we're not quite there just yet.
Okay.
But it's an area that will have a major change of education in the next 10 years. Just a little while off yet, though.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so let's keep going on the text. So looking at the policy implications of these different processes, there's some information there about how policy development occurs. And remember, while this is very much around country level, the same sorts of issues occur at a school or sector or an individual classrooms level as well. So one of the big issues is around trying to unfreeze a system. We talked a bit before about how sometimes technological restrictions can build up and restrict what can occur in the learning process because of policies and things that people can't see alternatives. Of course, they see it as a system-wide policy level process, and they feel that that can't change. But policies are simply just decisions, and they can change. It just needs to have enough levers on that process to enact that change. Monitoring and evaluation educational change, we talked a bit about that and the need for more research to actually understand what's occurring. And then we've got some various components. So there's a policy component of any issue. Having a strategic vision is one aspect, and we'll be looking at strategic visions a little bit later. Strategic visions are controversial. A lot of people spend a lot of time creating vision statements that never really seem to make any real difference. But most of the good research around enacting change agree that there needs to be a strategic vision. Even if it's not in itself particularly useful, not having one and not having gone through the process is an indicator of something of processes that won't work well. So a lot of people argue around the idea of strategic visions, but they are identified in the research as an important aspect of any effective systemic change. But other big key drivers are around professional development and the valuing of professional development, something we don't do well here in Australia. We often introduce a lot of change, and particularly around technology, without looking at the investment needed in teachers in terms of engaging with that technology and engaging with that technology to enact change. But there's also around the issue of pedagogical change. Now, this has actually been an area that has been strongly supported by government and sectors. Of course, they've seen pedagogy change as something that's valuable, and they've tied that to the introduction of technology, often to the detriment of both approaches, but they've invested in technology on with the intent of changing pedagogical practice in schools. And in many cases that has been successful, certainly in terms of the innovative teachers that engage with technology, they do tend to engage with different pedagogies as part of that process. But not every teacher does that, unfortunately. And that's where, if a teacher hasn't engaged with pedagogical change and wants to retain a very didactic pedagogy, for example, they will often not value the technology because it's not seen as supporting their pedagogy. And they didn't get involved with the technology in order to change their pedagogy. They got involved with the technology on the promise that it would improve student learning, without understanding that the real intent of the introduction of the technology and the power of the technology to improve student learning was very much tied with changing their pedagogical practice. Another aspect is around curriculum development, changing what's actually taught to students. Again, this was a problem in Australian schools up until very recently, where we were still teaching about how to use applications such as Word and PowerPoint and Excel, where the technology had moved on to be able to enable far greater uses of the technology to support student learning than just learning about how to use Office applications. But the new digital technologies curriculum and the ICT general capabilities are aimed at reinvigorating the curriculum to better match the capabilities of the current technologies. And another one is around assessment reform. Again, not one we've moved very far with in Australia. And in fact, we've probably gone backwards around large-scale assessment of students. And we may see that continue to go backwards with the introduction of NAPLAN Online in the near future, and the opportunities that provides to do a lot more large-scale collective assessment. As a researcher, I love large-scale collective assessments and getting huge amounts of data, but the intent of that data to improve individual teachers' teaching practice and individual students identifying gaps in their learning is not necessarily well supported by large systemic assessment programs. But they have other political uses, and I'm sure we'll still see them for a number of years to come. Other issues are around restructuring the school itself and the nature of how schooling is conducted, be it around a physical space or around time. And that time might be changing the school days so that students study at different times or in a more flexible way. It could be around changing their access to expertise, where you have the pools of teachers instead of specific teachers that you're allocated to. And it can be around changing the physical space to allow more university-style school-based environments or other types of environments that promote learning in different ways around project-based learning. So there's a whole issue around the use of ICT and technology to support changes in how we do schooling, including, of course, all the different aspects of online schooling and how that can be mixed in with physical schooling and provide other alternatives and more flexibility in the way students learn. And then the final one is around technology infrastructure. This is around the hardware and the software and the internet connections that enable everything to work well, and how reliable that is and how much technical support there is to sustain that, how much teachers are expected to engage with that technical support, how much control that technical support has over the pedagogical decisions in the organisation, and a whole lot of other issues around technological infrastructure. Okay, so any comments on all of those issues?
Yeah, I've got a bit of a problem. Some of those things have actually come up in my Delphi study. So is that going to be okay? Because it was issues like assessment and admin attitudes and tech, you know, the hardware aspect, and like those are some of the things that have come up. My little group of experts, I kind of just ran around because, like you say, teachers are busy, And so trying to get them to respond to anything was a nightmare. So I just ended up running around talking to people. And
That's a good approach.
yeah, well, it worked for me. But basically they said the technology, they can't, like none of us can keep up with the pace of what it is. So they were far more concerned with what underpins its use in a classroom. And things like teachers are always obsessed with assessment. So those, yeah, kind of those things have come up for me.
Absolutely, and I would have hoped that they would.
Oh, good.
No, it'd be very surprising if you'd come up with something that hadn't been well established in the research literature. We've talked down what research has been done. There has been a fair bit of research done in this over the last couple of decades, and we do have a reasonably good understanding of what makes programs work well and what makes them not work well. And particularly UNESCO, because they invest huge amounts of money in trying to ensure that that works well in the most difficult circumstances in countries. They spend a lot of time trying to unpack those issues. And you'll use your Delphi study results, but you'll also use these issues and ideas raised in these readings to develop your implementation plan. So it doesn't just have to be drawn from your Delphi study. You can incorporate lots of other ideas that we come across during the course. It's all about making the best implementation plan you can. And one of the ways of ensuring that is by considering all of these different factors and building those into your planning. Hutan, did you have any questions or want to raise anything from what was just discussed?
Yeah, I want to say something about assessment, because I believe that the most problem of the biggest problem of the educational system is coming from assessment problem. It's my belief, and I think because it's always start from assessment, and because of assessment we design curriculum and we design the pedagogic system. Always pedagogy is running for assessment, and assessment is always influence pedagogy in negative way. That's my belief, and I hope that someday technology can make a system, design a system that could assess a cognition of students, can design a system that can fairly measure the understanding of students instead of just particular information that makes the pedagogy like this, like today, that every students and teachers are just teaching for testing, and those testing are not actually the good measure of understanding. Do you know what I mean?
No, you raise a very important issue around testing, and unfortunately, in current environment, testing does tend to drive the agenda to a large extent, and it is a problem. And teachers generally recognise that, and good teachers tend to still teach despite the imposition of assessment. But the course assessment is so often mandated from outside the control of teachers. It does tend to have a larger weighting than many other teacher-led decision-making processes. But for example, we were talking before about the use of EEG headsets and some of the research I've been doing. One of the studies I'm trying to conduct is measuring students' brainwave patterns and matching their learning to their assessment performance, with the idea that if I can get a close enough match, it'll never work particularly well with individuals, but over large groups, if I can get a close enough match, we may be able to, using the brainwave patterns that they display during the learning process, be able to say whether or not they've learnt something without the need to then actually have other forms of assessment. That's a very, very long-term goal, and one that probably won't be achieved within the next couple of decades. But that's the idea of where technology may allow us to conduct assessment of students in a way that's not intrusive. so that the learning process can still continue without being focused around students having to do abstract performances of whether or not their brain has actually learned something or not.
Mm.
Okay, so I'm just going to go through the last chapter because we are just about out of time. In fact, we are out of time. But I'll just quickly skim through chapter 8. Oops. There we are. This is really a comparison of countries and how different countries have transformed their education through the use of educational technologies, or how educational technologies have had an impact upon that. So you can read through these and look at how different countries have approached things. Singapore, because of their size and their centralized control, have had a lot of innovative approaches and have done a lot of interesting things with technology. Their problem is they never stick to great innovations. They always then look for the next great innovation without bedding it down to see really long-term systemic change. But they certainly are very innovative. Uruguay has had a particular approach around professional development. Jordan has one there as well. Namibia and a number of other countries, Rwanda. And then you can look at the comparison that has been made about how each of those countries have approached things and why they've been successful or not successful. And a lot of it does have to do with other factors other than the decision-making around use of educational technology. The political support that they have, the institutional arrangements that support the implementation, the actual capacity to conduct the implementation strategy that they've chosen, the professional development focus that they've had, how they've monitored and evaluated the changes, the money that's been committed to supporting their implementation plans, and how they've actually gone from good practice in isolation to scaling it, to making it applicable to a large number of students and classes and schools, how it's been sustained, because often innovations can last a very small amount of time, and then they then die away very quickly. And the processes that they've gone through to leverage those changes, and what have been the most important leverages. Particularly, they've identified policy and ICTs as the major factors in terms of making that change. And you can have a look at those. But those same factors and influences can also apply to a school or to an individual classroom at different points, and some of them are more important than others, but the issues are all the same regardless of the level. So while we're looking here at countries, it is still possible to apply those same issues to individual teachers or individual classrooms or schools. And this leapfrogging concept is an important one. This is where the idea that you have to move through all the different steps of change is challenged, and the possibility of jumping across various steps and going from just using basic technology to using very advanced technology has been demonstrated in some instances, but it is a challenging aspect. And most countries and systems and schools tend to move through a progression. Okay, and so there's issues there around planning a trajectory and monitoring its implementation, building capacity to affect change, looking for partnerships and support for that. And you can read those and include that in your own planning for your implementation plan for your second assignment. So we need to wrap things up, but is there any final questions or comments you'd like to make?
No, thank you.
Okay then. Well, I look forward to seeing your assignments, and I'm very hopeful that there'll be really wonderful understandings of the educational environments that you've been exploring.
Jason, I do have one last question. I don't have to identify my school. Can I give it like a Bugs Bunny State High name or something?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
No, there's no need. Yeah. Keep in mind the intent of the assignment. It's to demonstrate your understanding of how we can understand an organization and look at how change could occur in that environment. I have no interest in knowing what the organization is or even the individuals. And the reality is you could be making up stuff. I'm not really going to know whether or not what you're describing is real or not, and I'm not going to try to verify that. It's much more about your explanation and your understanding of the concepts that we've been looking at in this course and showing that process rather than how detailed or accurate the actual case is of your situation. Okay then, well, it's finished up and I look forward to seeing you all next week.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.